Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing the situation in Saudi Arabia and Sheikh Nimr's court case. Joining us on the show is FrankGilli, who is an Anglican priest and cultural critic and commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Father Frank. What's taking place in Saudi Arabia?
Well, let's focus on a key episode which is very disturbing, which is the detention, arrest, detention, imprisonment and torture of a well-known Saudi dissident, a Saudi citizen, Sheikh Nimr, who is a scholar of Islam, who belongs to a minority in Saudi, the Shia minority, who are mostly in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. It's just as a if you like, a parenthesis. Saudi Arabia is a very, possibly the only country which is named after a family, the House of Saud, who took over at the beginning of the last century, thanks to the British, largely. That's just an interlude. But coming back to Sheikh Nimr, he fights for the rights of his community, who have been discriminated against, persecuted, often in violent ways, deny some basic rights of practicing their religion or worshipping. And Sheikh Nimr is a non-violent person. As a preacher, he is quite fiery, is quite stirring. I've watched one of his sermons on YouTube, and not only was I impressed by his personal appearance, he has a noble, very sort of noble spiritual look, and he speaks with great passion, very vigorously, as indeed a preacher should do, but also is quite clearly conscious of the oppression, the injustice perpetrated against his own people. Now, that was before he was arrested. I believe he was shot, he was wounded in a leg, and he was initially denied medical assistance, and he's now being incarcerated in prison for more than 800 days. And that is very, very concerning. Now, as I understand, he has been accused of sowing dissension, and I believe the Arabic word used is fasad, which means form of corruption, as well as undermine national unity. Now, my question here is, how can someone who protests peacefully, non-violently, against oppression, be said to sow dissension, fasad, corruption? Quite the opposite. It is the regime which embodies those negative aspects, which, if anything, can be accused of being fasad. Now, I would like to say I'm not per se against the people of Saudi Arabia. I've met Saudi students in London who were very fine young men, who were not fanatics, who were spiritual, and who for whom I had high regards and friendship. And even King Abdullah, I must say, I liked when I saw on YouTube once he met with the Pope. He went to the Vatican, he and his fellow shuyukh, and they were all received by the previous Pope, Benedict XVI. And it's interesting that particular video disappeared. And I believe the reason is some people in Saudi didn't like the idea of King Abdullah being seen alongside the Pope. And it was something which potentially had good interfaith aspects. So I wanted to put that in Dianaka, because I want to make clear that I'm not calling for hatred or for violence, God forbid, towards Saudi Arabia. What I'm talking about here is a basic type of injustice, an episode, an example of injustice, which people in Saudi who are concerned about their own country reputation should make sure to redress. Because if a man has been detained and tried on spurious charges, a man who is a spiritual leader, a man who is stands up for his community, who is prominent in his community, that man should not be ill-treated. They should not. Now, I also believe that he's been sentenced to death.
He's been sentenced for to be crucified. That's his actual sentencing.
Yes. Now, crucifixion, as a Christian, of course, I'm particularly sensitive about that type of execution. It's a horrible execution. I believe that part of the execution afterwards, his head would be cut off and his body will be exposed to a public infamy, so to speak. Now, how can we justify, how can anyone justify that type of barbarity, whatever historical reasons for that, in the case of a man who, again, is not a violent revolutionary, who has not called for, unlike, I know there are some extreme sects and groups in Saudi Arabia who call for a violent overthrow of a government. And that is a separate area, separate discussion. But focusing on Sheikh Nimr, it is quite clear that he's not, doesn't fall into the category of a violent, subversive revolutionary. Although I suppose he does come across as very passionate, but it is right to be passionate for your community. After all, the Shia minority belong to Saudi Arabia. They are not aliens. And the charge of undermining national unity is also extremely spurious, because naturally, when a minority is oppressed, when a minority is discriminating against, it tends to feel emotionally and spiritually connected with its brethren, brothers who are, so we're saying in the case of Bahrain, for example, little Bahrain, tiny Bahrain, but which is actually now suffering a terrible oppression. There is an insurrection. But the majority of the people of Bahrain against the royal family, who are actually, in so many ways, infringing their rights. And the Saudis have been called to aid the regime and to put down the insurrection. There's been an armed intervention in Bahrain. And so naturally, the people of Qatif, the area, eastern area, Shia, feel a sense of solidarity with their fellow Shia Muslims who are also suffering oppression. So, but that does not mean that Sheikh Nimr, as I understand, is calling for the collapse of Saudi Arabia, not at all.
That's the thing, when the protests first began in February 2011, the protests that were taking place were very peaceful. No one had weapons at the time during the protests in Qatif, in Saudi Arabia, and in Bahrain, as you mentioned the country. But the situation is that because the governments feel threatened, even though the people themselves have said it many times, we don't want to remove you, we just want to feel equal, because most of the people in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain feel as if they are third-class citizens, and the majority don't even have citizenship. Don't you think instead of the governments being brutal to the people, they should instead treat them more equally, or at least a second class?
Well, it's interesting. You said, we usually tend, when people are discriminated against, we say second class. So you said third class. So it's quite a striking expression because it emphasizes the degree of discrimination and oppression. And there are some people, I believe, from the Wahhabi main religious establishment of Saudi Arabia who have been calling for their extermination, who have been using language which would make anybody in a free country extremely, it would be a criminal language to use. So yes, and we go back to the idea that it should be in the interest of the Saudi government, King Abdullah, his advisors, to grant the basic rights to the minority, so that there would be reconciliation. Reconciliation is a key thing, but we want the reconciliation to begin with the freeing of Sheikh Nimr. He should be freed, and first of all, his death sentence should be quashed. He should be pardoned, well, if that's the right expression, because he's not guilty of a crime in the first instance. It's interesting that I came across, 2 weeks ago, an item online saying that King Abdullah had pardoned Sheikh Nimr. Then I learned, I checked it out, that it was actually disinformation. They did it on purpose, some people acting, in order to stop the demonstration which I myself took part in on Friday night in front of Downing Street, the residence of Prime Minister. So they're up to, little dirty tricks, but that implies, in a way, it's a telling episode. It shows how they realize that it is an injustice, because...
But as they realize it's injustice, why would they still carry it out? Because, as you said, there's more than one article even stating that they've, removed the court case and he's just going to be imprisoned instead of being crucified. However, when you look into the article further, in many articles they would say that there isn't actual proof or an exact report by the Saudi government. So then, at the end of the day, that's not actual factual. You can't just go by that article.
Right.
But the situation is that as it's taking place, and many people have gone against it, and many people are going to the streets, like in Downing Street and other places around London and even the world, why is Saudi Arabia still, it's not even saying anything about it, and it's just kept that sentence on him?
Well, that just underlies the fact that the judicial system of Saudi Arabia is something which in no way can it be compared to any judicial system which is open, transparent and fair. If you're not even able to find out whether someone has been sentenced, if there has been a sentence, if a sentence has been quashed, what the legal situation is, you're led to conclude that we are dealing here with a system which is not justice, but is based on something arbitrary, something which is secretive, which is itself corrupt. Because basically, when you have the law, the judicial process should be open, should be transparent, should be accessible to all. You should be able to see someone has been imprisoned, there is a charge, there is a trial, there is a sentence, there is a procedure for asking for revision, looking at it and even pardon. But if all this is not accessible, if it's not open, if it's not public, it's not transparent, then you're dealing with a tyranny. And so if that is the situation, what is the attitude, after all, we are in Britain, or the British authority, the British government towards Saudi Arabia? We know that because unholy oil, there is a close connection between the Saudi government, Saudi regime, and the British political elites. And even the monarchy, we saw Prince Charles fated and dying in Saudi and doing the sword dance, which I personally like that dance myself. But I mean, I'm afraid surely if there are such warm relationship between British establishment and the Saudi establishment, then there is such a responsibility. Because how can you be so closely connected to a regime which shows itself so incapable of delivering justice? Then you yourself can be said to be implicated in an injustice. Because after all, you know, Naka, I was brought up in a world where people very often, when it was a case of a government doing something, there was a line which people trotted on a lot. Well, we cannot interfere in the internal affairs of another country. So, but that line, you know, today would be like a dinosaur who said, oh, we cannot, because the British government is always intervening, well, in many ways, sometimes very unpleasant ways, pontificating about what's happening in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, in Pakistan. So if that is the case, if it is okay to make pronouncements and indeed to have sanctions and actions towards a government, for a government, a regime which behaves in ways considered unacceptable, right or wrong reason, well, why doesn't that apply to the case of Saudi Arabia? And in particularly, the case of his blatant example of injustice and of danger of hanging over the life of a good man.
Many people, his brother actually, after the court, after they gave the sentence at the court, the judge was saying that Sheikh Nimr was attacking the police and how he was, there became a gunfight between them. But his brother was saying that Sheikh Nimr doesn't even own a gun and he doesn't even have a gun, and he was walking to them to, give himself because he didn't want to create violence. But they then shot him 4 times in the leg to make it as if he was fighting. As the court is using, the words of the police or whoever, I'm not sure exactly who they're using the words of, but saying that Sheikh Nimr had weapons, can't they kind of like use that to justify their action in a way?
Well, of course, when you get this sort of charge, you justify the police shooting at someone in a system, judicial system where you have justice, then you could call upon witnesses, people who were there, and ask them, not just the police, because the police obviously tend to be partial, especially if they committed something which is not right. So you call upon the evidence or witnesses. So there were witnesses there, presumably there were many people who were looking on. So why aren't those people called upon to give evidence? We want the testimony of other people. You can't rely only on the testimony of the police because, they are the ones who, by hypothesis, have perpetrated injustice. So it seems that the whole system is vitiated by a lack of transparency, lack of justice. There is a secret police. Now, we got secret service in this country as well, and they're not exactly candid or lily white. But in the case of Saudi, it seems that secret police there really are the ones who are undermining any confidence in the judicial system. And so what we need here is first an acknowledgement. First, we must demand that Sheikh Nimr should not be executed. And the reason, well, it's justice, but also I think the best way of stopping people from doing something wrong is say it is not in your own interest. So, as I mentioned before, it should be conveyed to the Saudi authorities that they really care for the country, for the stability of the system. They should not commit such a gross and cruel, we're talking about cruelty, it's a cruel execution. That's not a way of carrying out a death penalty which would be regarded as civilized in any country I know of. Cruel and unjust means of execution, that should be stopped. It should be made clear, publicly said it will not take place. And then we start talking, and well, the second one is Sheikh Nimr, it's absurd that he should be sentenced to life imprisonment. Then he should be released, and there should be a reconciliation process with the community he represents.
But then one way to look at the situation, when he was shot in the leg 4 times, 4 bullets in his leg, at the time the Saudi government regime didn't want to help him medically until the Human Rights Watch interfered and kind of like forced it upon them. As they act, as the sentence he has received is very brutal and injustice, can't human rights also interfere in that sense?
Well, I would not call it interfering. I would say it's a legitimate ground for intervention. Interfering, you may think that it is something negative. No, I think it is a fundamental question of rights. The human rights ideology, as understood in the West, I have some reservations with. But certainly a basic question of rights, which are vested in the human person, not only by a system, but also by God. Because I believe a very foundation of rights, not even human rights, you want to call it expression, is ultimately based on the Creator. Now, and that's why in some cases when people invoke human rights, when quite clearly it's not conform with the will of the Creator, I have reservations, like in some cases in the West. But in this case, yes, I would say human rights are conform to a notion of there is an intrinsic justice of fairness. I was a school teacher many years ago, and sometimes when I remember the kids, when they feel that something is wrong, they say, "Sir, it's not fair. It's not fair." And it's very important because it's almost an instinctive, natural way in which we react. You don't pick on someone for no reason or just because you dislike him or her. There must be good reason. So there is an innate sense of fairness, of justice, which human beings share. I would say that justice, a sense that is ultimately derived by the Creator, by God. And so that is why it's important that we see this battle within the context of human rights. But coming back to your question, yes, there should be a pressure, but ultimately, obviously, regime governments act on the basis of self-interest. It is self-interest. And alas, even most human beings, very few are totally committed to justice and freedom just because they love them, but it's a self-interest. So it is not. It should be conveyed, and I think the British government is really should not be let off the hook here. They should really convey it they have many ways of doing that, diplomatic ways, personal ways, to the Saudi authorities. It is not in their interest to persecute, execute a man who is not a violent insurrectionist, who is not a violent revolutionary, a man who is only demanding the basic rights for his community.
As you just said, Sheikh Nimr was asking for the basic rights of his people, of his community. But then when he was in the court, they accused him of also being influenced by Iran, and how Iran has kind of like funded him and his community to start protesting and to, as they said, cause disunity in Saudi Arabia. How has, do you think, Iran influenced them, as if it actually has?
Well, this is an old line which the Saudi regime likes to trot out. and it goes back, well, it goes back a long way, but there were unpleasant killing of Shia pilgrims during the Hajj. They took place, I think we're talking about back to the late 70s. And from then on, after the Iranian Revolution, and from then on, the Saudi regime has been particularly keen on invoking the threat of Iran in order to justify its own oppressions. Now, two things here. One is the Iranians, of course, would deny that they are fomenting, as it were, violence or disobedience in Saudi Arabia. But secondly, the important point is, if you are a community, in this case, talking about a Shia minority in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, which is picked upon, which has its basic rights violated, which is sometimes attacked with violence, well, it is natural that it would, in a way, feel a sense of connection and seek support from their own brethren in Iraq. Iraq, after all, is a Shia majority country, and in Iran. It is not unnatural. So if the regime wants to scotch this idea, danger of Iranians interference, which I think I'm a bit skeptical about. I mean, after all, doesn't the British government interfere in lots of countries, to promote its own agendas? And Saudi Arabia itself, what is fomenting now in the civil war in Syria, funding and supporting, is the famous people who should live in glass houses should not throw stones. So I'm not sure the Saudis are quite in a position to pontificate on this. But again, if they want to deter the minority from feeling inclined towards stressing the links with Iran, they should give them their rights. And then they have no reason they may feel, after all, in Europe, we have all sorts of examples we have the Scots in Britain who do not feel they want to be many of them anyway, would not feel that they want to be united with England and the United Kingdom, but they've been allowed to express their views. They get all the possible local autonomies and self-government as possible. So the Scots are not fighting physically, violently against the London government, although in the past they have. But the point here is that, if you treat people like dirt, if you attack them, if you discriminate, if you insult them, then they naturally will seek help from wherever they can get it.
The situation in Saudi and even in Bahrain has been going on for far too long. It's been over 3 to 4 years now that the attacks are still taking place, that many people are being oppressed, even with the Sunnis who are to help the Shia whilst demonstrating or whilst trying to get their voice heard, they're still attacked. Why do you think that, firstly, the media isn't really focusing on these two countries, and especially on the minority? Even though in Bahrain they are the majority, but the minority in Saudi Arabia. And secondly, why isn't anyone interfering? How come it's still taking place?
Well, the media, of course, it's amazing how the media tend to have a fairly univocal type of agendas. I like watching news, especially foreign news, a lot, and I like to switch between the BBC and Sky TV and ITV sometimes, or Channel 4. And they are always, by and large, saying the same narrative. They describe the same episode, focusing, but maybe slight variations. But on the whole, you have some sort of, it's one-dimensional. It's very rare. You have to watch RT, Russia Today, or Press TV, alternative channels to get a different kind of narrative, and it's quite refreshing at times. So why should the media have it one side? Well, there's an ideology here which sort of underlies much of the media narrative, which has some characteristics. One is, if you like, it's the war against Islam, which is, and particularly the forms of Islam which they consider as a threat. Now, so there is that, but also there is sort of, let's call it spade a spade, is NATO, isn't it? It's basically, Bahrain isn't a huge American base, just in Bahrain or near Bahrain. And oh boy, why do you need a huge American base next to a tiny little country? It's just a few islands. Bahrain is very small, as a matter of fact. And so why do you need, why does the United States need the military bases all around? After all, it's a long way from America. Why would it be wrong for Iran to have a base in Central America, for example? They would never accept it. And they say, oh, it's a threat, it's intolerable. But why is it okay to have American bases scattered around the world? What God-given right have the United States or having military base scattered everywhere? And NATO and the British media, we are talking about, the BBC, we're talking about ITV, we're talking about Channel 4 and Sky, they really are all in cahoots with this ideology of supremacy, which is, United Kingdom is just plain poodle of the United States. There is no sign or independent narrative or independent policy. So they're all embracing, they're all purveying this kind of ideology. It's interesting, Karl Marx defined, not my hero, but still a thinker, some interesting thinker, considered ideology a form of false consciousness, something which is false, which arises out of some basic fundamental material interest, but then when it generates, and what we got here is a false consciousness, which is masquerading itself as objectivity. And as to your second question, sorry, what was the second question?
The second one was, how come that that many countries are silent about it, and the governments, they're not really governments, they're more like royal family in Saudi Arabia and in Bahrain, continuing to do this without anyone stopping them?
Well, they continue to do it because, if you like, in physics, there's a law of inertia, isn't there? There's a body which is moving across unless interfered upon, will continue its trajectory. And similarly, I think if you are an oppressive, tyrannical regime, unless you are pulled up short, you will continue doing it. Now, as I said, I'm not an enemy of the Saudi people. And as I say, I've had a few Saudi friends who were, students who were delightful young people. And King Abdullah, when he went and met the Pope, I thought, I love that one. There's a potential for interface, exchange, everything else, isn't it? So I don't want to damn the whole Saudi Arabia. All I'm saying is, in the interest of Saudi people, they should be brought to, it should be brought to bear upon them. The regime, they must first quash the sentence, a death sentence, release Sheikh Nimr, and grant basic rights to a minority.
Of course, like when speaking about the situation in Saudi, we're not just attacking them, we're just speaking about the justice, because if, as you said, like everyone was treated equally, especially the minorities, no one would really have anything against them, no one would say anything. But because many people, and it's not only Sheikh Nimr who's actually, been imprisoned or been actually
many
killed.
others, yes.
Many others have,
Yeah.
and because Sheikh Nimr is a very, outspoken religious speaker who has influenced many people, spiritually, politically, and in many other ways also. So for him to be, sentenced is kind of like making everybody else scared in a way. And that's why, like, of course, nobody would want such a thing. And even if he was an original man, no one would want it. But the situation where it's, become that, the sentencing of it doesn't really make sense. Because one time they say that, Iran's involved, and the other time they're saying that they're creating disunity. But the whole point of the protest was because there was disunity.
Right.
So
right.
for them to focus on that point doesn't really make much sense, because the minority is protesting because there isn't unity in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is the regime which is fostering and disunity. And so it is the regime which should be called to account and to remove the grounds of the disunity. Of course, there is also, as you're aware, there is a debate going on between within Islam concerning the various points of view of the two major sects of Islam, the Sunni and Shia. That is something which is there. I was watching on YouTube last night, there was a debate between one of the guys who is from Pillars? Anyway. There is a debate, but what's internal to the Islamic community. And this debate exists even in Christianity. So although we become so kind of wet and lukewarm these days that we don't care about some issues which should be cared about. But the point here is that there is debate going on. This debate sometimes take forms because of political, economic, which are no longer intellectual, theological. They are confrontational, violent, which don't have to be. So, in a way, how Sunnis should relate to Shia to Sunni is something which belongs to Islam. So it's not something which, but as someone who is a friend of Islam, who's engaged in interfaith dialogue, I think that is a different affair. People should not use the debate to bring about strife and mayhem and to perpetrate injustice. It should not be. The nearest in this country, look at Northern Ireland. It's a smallish place, but there was confrontation between Catholics, Roman Catholic, and Protestants. Now, some people say it was not so much about religion, but it was about social circumstances, discrimination, and so on. In fact, religion was bound up with it. I think religion was important. But so the reason I'm mentioning this is because, here in Britain, in Europe, we have examples. But you can still have, and a strict Protestant would still not agree with some basic Catholic doctrines.
That's fine. For example, you mentioned it in the Christian faith. In the Islamic faith, as you said, we have the Shia group and we have the Sunni group. However, when we look at the overall picture, it's all about Islam. And the message of Islam is to live peacefully. So you shouldn't, if you don't agree with someone, you would put that to a side, because, you still have to treat them as a human at the end of the day and not hold what they believe against them, because at the end of the day, that's between them and God. So that shouldn't be the problem. But in Saudi Arabia, and especially in Bahrain, that's what we're actually seeing, because, someone is a Shia, for example, they're being oppressed, not for a valid reason. If I was to believe something, I wouldn't want somebody to judge me just on that belief and not consider me as a human.
Yes, there are some red lines which should not be crossed in some of these dialogues, if you like, intra-Muslim dialogues. This chap on YouTube was saying, for example, we cannot tolerate people who insult the Prophet wives because we regard them as mothers or believers, or an example. But And, there's a debate which are within Islam. It's not up to me to, but it's similar in Christianity. You could say Protestants deliberately insulted the shrines of the Virgin Mary, or made a point of defacing the images of the saints and so on. It was very sad and very brutal and intolerant. But partly because I hope we become more tolerant, partly because people don't give a damn about religion anymore, which is very sad. Because, Naka, I want to say there is one side of me which says that although I condemn violence, because I'm a Christian, and I think violence is irrational, brutal, and all that, I think that I understand how, because faith is so important and people can feel absolutely passionate and devoted, really fiery intense about one's own faith. However, that is a different affair from committing blatant injustice and, of course, violence, killing. Killing in the name of God is what gives religion a bad name, isn't it?
That is true. And what shouldn't actually take place is if someone is, has that passion for religion, they shouldn't act violently. There are many ways to act. And,
That's it, absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much for joining us. Unfortunately, you've run out of time. Thank you very much for being with us on Beneath the Surface. And thank you very much for watching. See you next time.